The 49ers offense is a fantasy football factory with Christian McCaffrey, Brandon Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and Brock Purdy. But there is even room for them to grow even more this next season. So we discussed the 49ers 2024 fantasy outlook on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. I am one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. I'm not doing this. I'm writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com and excited to break down another team with Michelle for you today from the NFC West.
Yeah, so we're going through all 32 teams. Each team gets their own episode, and we break down their entire cast of offensive weapons and their fantasy outlook in 2024. We started with the Rams on Monday, went through the Seahawks yesterday, and today we're going to talk all the way through the San Francisco 49ers, which is not an easy thing to do because they're absolutely loaded. But is there enough space for them all to be great this year? Probably not. So we have to talk guy by guy and see who we like and who we don't like for this year. Obviously, the 49ers, their last season was amazing as we expected. They lost in the Super Bowl to Patrick Mahomes, but still a really great season. Third in the NFL in average points per game scored. Second in the NFL in fantasy points per game scored, very barely behind Detroit Lions. Had the league leader in scrimmage yards and Christian McCaffrey. Had a top 8 player in receiving yards and Brandon Aiyuk. Had the leading tight end in receiving yards and George Kittle. And then I had a top 3 quarterback in passing touchdowns and Brock Purdy. And then just throw in Deebo Samuel in there as well, who had 1,000 scrimmage yards last year and is kind of just like, an afterthought. But let's start with the main guy here, Christian McCaffrey. RB1 in 2023, as always. Is there any worries for you, Vinny? Because, the only place you're getting Christian McCaffrey is the 101, right? Is there any worries for you, him entering his 28-year-old season, that maybe he shouldn't be going first overall in drafts?
I think he has 2 really great seasons left. And I think part of it is, hey, he's not hurt because he's playing for the 49ers and he's on a good team and he enjoys it and he's got great blocking. He's not getting touched a lot the way he was not the focal point of this offense when he came to it. There was a whole bunch of different guys, and that's still the case. I still think teams try to stop him, but how do you do that? Because if you take away him on the ground, he's going to beat you in the short passing game. So this is prime McCaffrey. I think he can also sense, if he puts together a couple more really good seasons here, he's talking Hall of Fame territory with his skills here. So I think he's that special. Like, he could have a couple more 2,000-yard scrimmage seasons, and he's in business here. And I think he thinks about that as well, that, look, this is a golden opportunity, and he's taken full advantage of it, really, come over. So I think until he gets to age 30, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I just like this situation where they manage him well. I think that you could see a few touches go away a little bit if they diversify. They did get Garendo in the draft, so we'll see what they do there. But they want to keep him fresh. He's still the focal point of this offense. He's the guy that they're going to give the ball to in scoring position most of the time. So, again, I need to see it to believe it. I didn't see any signs of him cracking. So until I kind of feel that again, I feel like he's just a new, rejuvenated running back. With Carolina, we were just done with this. Do we take a chance on him? But now in San Francisco, we're like, how can he not get it done, right? So barring injury, but everyone is an injury risk at running back. We know that. Everyone has some of that. Jonathan Taylor, you go down, Breece Hall's had a big injury. Bijan is not injury proof. So he's a clear 101 to me. I think enjoy it. If you've got him in a dynasty league for another couple seasons, it's going to be great.
What is interesting is that history tells us that 28-year-old running backs or older, they just don't have those huge fantasy seasons, right? So last year, Christian McCaffrey is at 24.5 fantasy points per game in PPR league. There hasn't been a running back in his 28-year-old season or older that has scored more than 21 fantasy points per game since 2007. So the last running backs to have like that monster great year that's worth the 101 pick, right? Like, 21 points per game would still be something you're happy about. That's like the Kyron Williams, Keenan Allen area last year. But for that 101 pick, you want the 24 points per game. And the last guys to put up 23 or 24 was LaDainian Tomlinson and Brian Westbrook in 2007. Now, I say all this, and I'm still taking Christian McCaffrey 101 because what do all three of these guys have in common, right? They're very similar style in that they can catch the ball a lot, right? So that kind of keeps these guys going into their older ages if they have those receptions. So again, I'm not worried about it. If you're worried about his age, maybe I would lean over to CeeDee Lamb. Like I wouldn't take a different running back, but maybe you look at CeeDee Lamb. Even Justin Jefferson at this point would be too nerve-wracking to take over CMC with his new quarterback. So yeah, it seems like Christian McCaffrey is pretty much locked into that 101, at least for one more season. Now, moving over to Brandon Aiyuk, their next best fantasy asset on this team. He finished as a wide receiver 14 last year in points per game. He was uber efficient, right? Because he only had 105 targets, but put up 1,342 receiving yards and 7 receiving touchdowns. So that's lower than we'd like. Can he get more targets this year, Vinny? Like, will the 49ers throw more? Because they did throw the fewest amount of times in the league last year.
Yeah, I think he's very similar in a weird way to DK Metcalf because he just had a little bit more juice on his side. He had a few more things come through. He made a few more big plays, and that was the separation. We saw DK Metcalf was wide receiver 20 and a half point PPR. You have Aiyuk at 14. So there's not much difference if you look at it and really cut through all that. It's not that big of a deal. And Aiyuk, again, a little bit big play dependent. I remember that game. I think they were it was maybe a Thursday night game where they just threw some bombs to Aiyuk that were maybe ill-advised, and he just added some points there just because they could do it. So he's a little bit too big play dependent for me. I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, that actually can add up, as we see with Metcalf, that less targets, but he can make more use of them and really stretch the field. So I'm wondering if that average drops a little bit and he's not as valuable as a scorer. Then all of a sudden you're looking at a guy that slides down the wide receiver 2 boards. But I would just be careful about overdrafting him. Just don't think he's going to duplicate. It's just hard to recreate that. Is his style of receiver can struggle to do. So I say just be careful with Aiyuk. I think I'd rather still take him as a wide receiver 3 because he was so efficient last year. I don't know if that can be duplicated here this year, especially when you consider maybe Deebo cuts into it a little bit more. You have George Kittle, and we know they have a first-round pick at wide receiver that could also be a factor, as well as Juwan Jennings.
Yeah, I'm not worried about Juwan Jennings. I will say that if Brandon Aiyuk gets paid this year, right, he's going to be asking for that $30 million contract. If they pay him, I would expect this team to pass more this year. They have to, right? If you're spending a first-round pick on a wide receiver, you're still paying Deebo Samuel, you're paying George Kittle top dollars, then you'd be paying Brandon Aiyuk as well. Like, this has to be more of a passing team. And I do think if there's more targets to go around, they're going to go to Brandon Aiyuk. At least that would make sense, right? If they're going to pay him that top dollar money, he needs more than 105 targets. But I do expect his efficiency to go down pretty big. So yeah. I don't know if he would end up scoring any more points this year, even if he does get those more targets. He finished as wide receiver 16 in fantasy points per game last year in PPR leagues. A big part of that was because he doesn't get the consistent targets, average just 4.7 receptions per game. It's the same amount as Kendrick Bourne averaged last year. Like, that shouldn't be how this is, but we'll see how they utilize him moving forward. I would love the 49ers to get to like 575 pass attempts. It's middle of the field in the NFL. They're only at 491 last year. So maybe we can see that increase. But when looking at his ADP right now, he's going as wide receiver 15. Do you think that's a fair price for him? He's going kind of like right at the top of that third round.
To me, I feel like his season last year was more of a ceiling in this particular offense. Now, if he goes somewhere else and he's the number 1, clearly, and they don't have a lot of guys that are throwing the ball to him, maybe he has that potential if he can eat up a bunch of targets and do that. But in this particular offense, I don't think you can go that high. Like, I think being in the top 15 is pretty aggressive. I mean, there's not a lot of wide receivers who you would say that you're going to trust more if you take him to wide receiver 15. I take him a few notches below, but I still think he's a solid wide receiver 2, but I'd say in the 20 to 25 range, so maybe even getting into the wide receiver 3s, just based on the way he plays and just based on how many pieces of competition he has. The one good thing he has on his side, he'll have a good floor because Brock Purdy will throw to him downfield quite often.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with his draft price. When looking at the other wide receivers around, I think it's fair. I'd rather him over Deebo Samuel, who we'll get to in a moment. I'd rather him over Stephon Diggs, over DJ Moore. I like Nico Collins is going ahead of Ayuk. I would rather Ayuk than Nico Collins
Yeah.
this year, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a crowd and it's the 49ers offense, if all things are equal otherwise, the talent is there for Ayuk, the offense is there, you got to go with Ayuk in a lot of situations there. So excited to see what he can do. But again, just to don't overdraft him. Again, wide receivers rarely end up scoring where they were the previous year, especially guys that are a little bit dependent on their yards per catch the way that Ayuk is. We'll get into the other receiver that we want to talk about a lot, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle at tight end, as well as the guy thrown to them, Brock Purdy, in our next segment. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. Wouldn't it be great if you could see all of your investment and retirement accounts in one place? With Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and access the expert analysis you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. When it comes to your financial future, you think you've done it all. You've saved, you've researched, you've invested all that you can. Now that you need to take all those investments to the next level, use what every financial great uses. That's Yahoo Finance. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor looking for the extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need in one place to dominate against the market. With a community of more than 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. That's only at yahoofinance.com. For a comprehensive financial news and analysis website, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. The number one financial destination for you. That's yahoofinance.com. Again, yahoofinance.com. All right, Michelle, let's get into the investments we want to make here in the 49ers pass game elsewhere, away from Brandon Aiyuk. Let's start with Deebo Samuel. Very good in terms of points per game in 2023, wide receiver 9. First of all, were you surprised by that? I guess it's always higher at the average because there's always a durability issue with his availability.
Yeah, I was completely shocked to see landed at wide receiver 9. I mean, he only had 89 targets, 892 receiving yards. He did come up with a career high 7 receiving touchdowns. And of course, he gets those rushing touchdowns that help him. He did have that really nice stretch there in the back half of the season where he went wide receiver 8, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 9 in a 4-game stretch. But like pretty much the rest of the year, he didn't do a whole lot. He's up and down. I actually am most worried about Deebo Samuel with the Ricky Pearsall drafting him in the first round. I do think they're looking for a different type of wide receiver that they can depend on more with the route running. Obviously, Deebo will be there. He will get his touches, but Pearsall might just dig into that a bit too. And even if they throw more, I don't necessarily think the targets will go to Samuel. Like they have to find some targets for Ricky Pearsall. They have to get Aiyuk more targets. They have to get George Kittle more targets. I just don't really see a spot for Deebo Samuel to get that many touches. So he's going to have to be uber efficient, get the rushing touchdowns. And I don't want to have to depend on that.
Yeah, Samuel and Aiyuk is going to be a big question here for a lot of fantasy managers, not just Aiyuk versus Samuel, but should you take one, knowing that there's going to be some weeks where one disappears and the other produces, and that happens a lot on this team where there's only one ball, and sometimes they just go to the matchups. Kyle Shanahan doesn't care that everyone gets even looks each week. He's looking, what's the best matchup I can exploit? And if that well is open, he's going to go back to it time and time again. And often it involves Samuel. So that's why you have that in points per game, because he has those blow up weeks, as Michelle said, and then he can not do much, because I think that's the nature of this 49ers offense. When you have 3 elite pass catchers, the way these guys can get going for Brock Purdy. And credit to Brock Purdy, he really puts the ball in the hands of these guys at the right times and the right matchup. So, yeah, I mean, I think they just have so much upside. Like, I think you just lock into both as a wide receiver too. I think they're both kind of set it and forget it guys. I wouldn't go too high, but you just got to play them every week, because any given week they can carry you. it might be a struggle for a few weeks, but just be careful. I mean, there are two receivers who can cut into each other's value. I think Samuel being healthy for a few more games would say we got to put his arrow up and Ayuk's arrow down when you're looking at the overall rankings. But it's pretty close. And again, if you'd rather not, just avoid that. You can take a shot later on maybe Pearsall, see what you can get with him. But I say if you go with these guys, I think Deebo, you're right. I think it's going to cut into more what Deebo does here. So I'd say Ayuk is probably a little bit better value than Deebo.
Yeah, if I'm choosing one, it's Ayuk for sure. Deebo, I don't understand. Like his wide receiver 16 cost right now, way too high. You can get Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, Amari
Yeah.
Cooper, 25 plus picks later, and I would rather all of them over Deebo. So Deebo won't be on any of my teams. He's a great player. Love him for the NFL and for the 49ers, but not for fantasy. George Kittle's another guy that I have not loved to roster on my teams. He always finishes high, right? Like again, last year, tight end 5 in points per game, but he's just so inconsistent. It's huge weeks and then really, really down weeks. It's like nothing in the middle. It's either he's tight end. Like this is really a span of time. He was tight end 26, tight end 32, then tight end 5, tight end 45, tight end 1, and then tight end 51. Like it's just a roller coaster with him. And as many games as maybe he'll win you, he's going to also lose you. So I don't love that. And he's not a guy that typically scores touchdowns. He had the one big touchdown year in 2022. Last year, he put up 6 touchdowns. Again, that was the second most in his career, but 3 of them came in one game. He only had 90 targets, the same amount as Cole Kmet, and only 3 more than Tyler Conklin. Like, there's not room for him to be consistently used here. And then also, like, we keep bringing up Pearsall edition. Like, I just don't see where more targets come for George Kittle this year.
Yeah, and you just have to live with George Kittle. I mean, he's like the better version of Dallas Goedert, where there's some weeks that Goddard disappears, some weeks he has a big game and they use him in the middle of the field, but he's a better version, Kittle is, of that. So you just have to live with it. He's not going to be as consistent as some other guys like Sam Laporta and Trey McBride, and that's why in a lot of drafts they're going ahead of George Kittle, but then he's also more exciting to have on your team than Evan Ingram, right? Like Evan Ingram could be steady, but is he going to win you a week? And maybe if he has a random big touchdown game like he did a couple years ago, but George Kittle is more likely to have those. And what I think, again, what makes me feel better about Kittle is I think Purdy. I think you look at Deebo Samuel, he's kind of been hurt by the presence of McCaffrey, who takes away those short passes and the scoring as a runner. And Purdy has a really good connection with Ayuk and Kittle downfield. And that's the thing. Kittle is a field stretcher here. And that's what Brock Purdy wants to do. So that helps. So there's a kind of the volatility that you get with Brandon Aiyuk as well. But you have to live with that. If you go after Kittle, to say he's going to have some big games, he's going to have some clunkers. You're just going to live with it and move on. And he might win you a week. He might just be indifferent for you another week, and you just have to accept that with him.
Yeah, I just think with the price, 60th overall, it's still too high to take a guy like that. Like I'd rather pay up for the more consistent guys that have similar upside that you just mentioned, or I would much rather have Evan Ingram in a full PPR league than George Kittle. But 60th overall, you're taking Kittle over guys like Jaden Reed, who has a high upside, Najee Harris, who has high upside, Dak Prescott or Kyler Murray at quarterback, or DeAndre Swift at running back. Like, those are too good of guys to be taking a guy like George Kittle, who has some really big weeks, but some really, really down weeks at the tight end position. So I would just, if I think I'm going to be paying up for a tight end this year to get the Trey McBride or Kincaid or Sam Laporta, or maybe even just stick with Kelsey because he keeps doing it right. And then if I do wait, it's not going to be for Kittle. That's all.
Yeah, I feel like him and Goddard are in the same spot last year, that in that middle zone of tight ends where I don't really want to go after. And for someone else, that's fine. If that's the tight end they like, and because he's fun to watch, he's a tight end you guy and you love him, and he can stretch the field and dominate in a few games, and you're happy with that, go with it. But again, I think you can do better value. I think looking at tight end, just don't force it there as a position. Oh, I need a tight end. So don't go after a tight end when there are good wide receiver running back values on the board, as Michelle mentioned. Now, Brock Purdy, that's our favorite guy that we like to keep backing here. He was QB 8 last year in points per game in 2023. That's pretty darn good. The question is, Michelle, has he hit his ceiling? Is there potential for him to be a top 5 fantasy QB despite not being a running QB?
I mean, there's definitely potential for him to be a top 5 quarterback, right? Like last year, he was 0.2, 0.3 points per game off of being the quarterback 5. So, like the top 4 quarterbacks were really distant from everyone else. And the Allen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, they all scored 20 or more fantasy points per game. But then quarterbacks 5 through 10, they all scored between 18 fantasy points per game to 18.7 fantasy points per game. So a 0.7 difference in points per game between those other 6 quarterbacks in the top 10. So take your pick there with who you think has the most upside to get into that range of the 20. But my pick then is going to be Brock Purdy because of how little the 49ers passed last year. Purdy had 444 pass attempts last year, the fewest among quarterbacks with 14 starts. To compare, Dak Prescott had 590 pass attempts. Josh Allen had 579. Jared Goff had 605. And Purdy had 444. Purdy was ranked 20th in pass attempts last year and 5th in passing yards. He was the first quarterback in NFL history to rank top 5 in passing yards in the season that a quarterback ranked 20th or lower in pass attempts. Like, what he does with his efficiency on the little amount of work he has was amazing. And I don't see that efficiency dying off, even if the pass attempts increase in this Kyle Shanahan offense with these weapons. He's still going to be uber efficient, and I expect them to pass a lot more. So I definitely see a top 5 finish for him this season, or the possibility of one.
Well, I think the one concern I have is there's some guys that are going to put up some running numbers and to some degree. I mean,
He
watch
did
out
say
for
he's
Jaden
working
Dan.
on his scrambling this offseason. That's a big thing he's
Yeah,
focusing on.
yeah, but is he going to be a guy that's going to like I think with Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams,
No,
right? These
yeah.
are guys that have entered the mix. Anthony Richardson, don't forget about him being healthy. So these are some guys that have some built-in situations, and they might have a higher passing volume here with their teams as well. So just watch that. And what I would also say is that the bar could be just raised for scoring, and he could have a top 5 season in terms of the scoring if it went to another year. But that's what you have to look at. And Michelle points it out really well here is like there's not much difference. So if there's not difference there, once you get past those running kind of cheat code QBs that we can trust, I mean, then they're pretty close. Like you could make a case for Brock Purdy over, say, a Jordan Love or CJ Stroud. There is that potential where you can say he can finish above these guys. And again, there's just so many guys who can score touchdowns on this team. And I look at Purdy. I don't think there's anything fluky about the way he gets the ball downfield. Everyone's going to say, okay, he's averaging all these yards per attempt. They're doing it after the catch. No, he's putting a lot of air under these balls, and that's the kind of intent of this offense. So, again, just be
Yeah, his
careful
yards from
of
after the catch are
overdrafting.
middle
That's
of the
all I'm going to
pack.
say.
Like
Yeah,
it
I mean,
wasn't any
yeah,
different than a Jordan Love. It was middle of the pack with his yards after catch. That's just like a fake narrative that people like to spin around. I will ask you, would you rather, I mean, have one question for Purdy and then we'll move on to our sleeper segment. But Joe Burrow in the 5th, 6th round, would you rather draft Joe Burrow
okay.
in the 5th, 6th round or wait to take Purdy in the 8th round?
I'm a waiter at quarterback, and I don't think the difference is going to be too much. So I can just think about all those players I can get in between, and then I get to Brock Purdy, and I don't have much difference at quarterback. That's again why we like 2 QB and super flex because these guys are so tight. But yeah, I do like Purdy quite a bit. And again, I think he has extremely high floor. Yeah, I think his floor is higher than what Jimmy Garoppolo had, and his ceiling is ever higher than him. So both those things combined say, yeah, I want Purdy quite a bit consistently. And again, we talk about overdrafting him. It's almost hard to do that because everyone's always undervaluing this guy. So you're not going to overdraft him. You're going to get him at a good value, even when you start at the rankings, and he might drop more than that in particular leagues. So I'm excited to see what Purdy can keep doing in this league.
Yeah, we're going to talk through Ricky Purcell, any of the other running backs on the 49ers, see if we're interested in rostering them in fantasy in 2024 to finish up our episode talking about the 49ers. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we brought up Ricky Purcell's name multiple times already, like what his impact could have on other players. But is there any space for him himself to be a fantasy asset as a rookie? Because I don't see any space for him available at all.
Yeah, this was an interesting pick, and they seem to love taking these guys. We've seen it with like a Ronnie Bell type. I know they waited for a different round to get him, and then Kyle Shanahan. I mentioned Isaac Orendo. They cannot quit taking offensive skill players. If there's someone that there's some vision of this player making some big plays at some point as like the sixth gadget player, Kyle Shanahan is going to take him, and they're just going to add him to the offense. So, but I think they're also realizing Deebo and Aiyuk, they're not going to be able to keep these guys around. They're going to have diminishing returns. Do they really want to invest at wide receiver when they have all these other things that they've locked up here with George Kittle being a big part of what they do? Brock Purdy deserves a big contract. They're paying more than most teams do to their running back. Wide receiver is where they think they can find some guys. And that's why I think they touted Jennings a little bit more to say, hey, we can get by with Jennings and Purcell if we wanted to. But for one more year, I think they're going to keep this Deebo Aiyuk combination. Then next year, I think you're looking at Ricky Purcell having some really good value. Like someone's going to have to pick up those targets. I see a lot of vacated targets that aren't Kittle and McCaffrey here in 2025 for the 49ers. So I don't think he's a bad stash, right? If one of these guys goes down, and Samuel's checkered injury history is there, Aiyuk has been banged up at times before in the past. He's not a bad, I hate to say this word or these combination of words, wide receiver handcuff. But I think it's true. If he can earn that job, I don't think they would move Juwan Jennings out of the slot because I think they find him comfortable there. I don't think Samuel is a true slot. Aiyuk has never been that guy. And I think they drafted Pearsall to be on the outside. So when you look at that, I mean, I think he would be the guy that would see increased targets. So just watch what he does in training camps if he's ready to see the field. I know it's a complicated offense to get down and be trusted in it. If there is that potential and they're like saying, okay, you're right behind these guys on the depth chart, that's where you're looking at this player late in your draft. And if maybe you have Samuel or Aiyuk and you're worried, but you know they could just pivot to this guy and he could be productive.
Yeah. The issue is it's not just one injury he would need. He might need multiple, right? Because Aiyuk, Kittle, Samuel, McCaffrey, we're all within 20 targets of each other, with Aiyuk leading at 105, Kittle at 90, Samuel at 89, CMC at 83. CMC is going to get his. Brandon Aiyuk still needs more targets, right? Like he needs to get up towards 130 if he's going to get paid that. George Kittle could still use more targets. Like, and then the next guy that I brought up, like all those four had between 80 to 105. It was Juwan Jennings at 33 targets. Like that was the jump, right? There's not room for a fifth guy. And if you're saying like Juwan Jennings will still have his snaps, right? So where is there room? And if what could he take Juwan Jennings 33 targets or Ray McLeod's 15 targets? Like it's just hard to find anything for him unless there are multiple injuries. So yeah, in the future, definitely like 2025, I'll be talking about him, I'm sure, as a nice sleeper, but this year, not so much. What about 49ers backup running backs? Is there anybody you would like to stash in case of a CMC injury? Whether it be Elijah Mitchell, maybe he might not even make the team. We'll see if he can make it. He has to stay healthy. But they just drafted Isaac Orendo in the 4th round. He's a big boy who runs a 4.33, over 220 pounds, runs a 4.33. That's exciting. Or maybe Jordan Mason. Any of those guys you're stashing if you roster CMC.
Yeah, this is difficult. It's not just take Elijah Mitchell for insurance because it's really wide open here. Jordan Mason has been good at times when getting the opportunity when Mitchell wasn't available behind McCaffrey. We know that. And we know that Orendo put on a show at the combine. He was the fastest running back there. So I kind of always lean toward the shiny new toy. That can really backfire, like the Tyrion Davis Price stuff that we got into just a couple of years ago with this team. Like, just be wary. Just pay attention to what's going on in the backfield because anyone could emerge as the top backup at any point here. So just pay attention, listen to the practice report, see what's going on in camp if someone's moving up, and try to read into it a little bit. Because again, I think again the Shanahans, if you go back, they are not really a committee team. They rather have one guy if they can in most cases. So I would say they would look for one guy to get the variety of touches because it offers more versatility from down to down if you don't have different backs in different situations. So that's what you're looking at really. So again, Orendo to me, talent-wise would be the guy I want to stash, but I don't know if I could draft him. We might just have to wait for the waiver wire because that might be a wasted spot if like Mason or Mitchell is still there. Like then you're just wasting a spot. But I think he's got the most upside, and I would be the most excited to see what he could do should McCaffrey go down.
Yeah, if Elijah Mitchell makes this team, right? And he's not like he wouldn't make it based off talent, but he has not been reliable. He was not been like they need a reliable backup that can come in if CMC goes down and Elijah Mitchell just gets hurt like after 2 touches. So I could see them moving on from him this offseason. But if he does make the team, that's the guy I'd want to roster, and I feel pretty good about that. If he doesn't, then I think it would be like a mixture of Guerendo and Mason kind of sharing if CMC missed any time. So I'm probably going to stay away, like you said, playoff waivers if you have to deal with it, or maybe like if you roster Christian McCaffrey, maybe towards the end of the season to play it safe, you pick up one of these guys once we have more information. But during the draft, I'm just going to kind of stay away. That is it for today's show. Thank you to you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Every dayers. We will be back tomorrow talking about the Arizona Cardinals and their 2024 fantasy outlook. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.